January 1945, Dresden, Germany. The world feels suspended in time. A deep silence hangs over the city, broken only by the distant hum of warplanes. Snow falls gently across the streets, but even the soft touch of winter cannot mask the grim reality of the war-torn city. The once grand and proud metropolis now lies bruised, its grand palaces and cultural landmarks shattered by constant air raids. In the quiet of the night, the blackouts are in full effect. Every home, every building, its windows sealed tight, as if the darkness could somehow shield them from the horrors above. But the darkness has become an ominous presence, much like the constant fear that grips the German population. Fear of the bombers that come without warning. No one can truly escape it. Amidst this turmoil, there's a peculiar moment. In the city's outskirts, a small group of American soldiers, recently arrived as part of the Allied occupation, begin to distribute something that catches the eye of the stunned civilians. Candles. The small, fragile flame flickers in the dark, an unexpected token of humanity amid the ruins. It's not the weapons of war the German people have come to expect from their enemies, but an offering, a simple gesture, that defies the brutal image of the American forces they had long been taught to fear. The year is 1944. Europe is entrenched in the throes of World War II. After nearly 5 years of brutal conflict, the Allies, led by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, are finally on the offensive. The war has taken a catastrophic toll on both sides, with millions of lives lost, countless cities reduced to rubble, and the future of entire nations hanging in the balance. In the Western theater, the Allied forces have gained a critical foothold in France. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi-controlled Europe. By the end of that year, the Allies had liberated vast swathes of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The momentum was building. But for Germany, the retreat was not just military. It was an existential one. Their borders were shrinking, and the once proud Reich was buckling under the relentless pressure from both the Allies in the West and the Soviets in the East. By 1945, the Allies had begun targeting German cities with increasing ferocity. The aim was twofold: to cripple Nazi industrial capacity and to break the morale of the German people. The bombing raids on German cities, which had intensified after the Allies gained control of the air, were devastating. Cities like Hamburg, Berlin, and Cologne had already suffered massive bombings, and by the early months of 1945, Dresden, once a jewel of European culture, had become the latest target. The rationale for these bombings was strategic. Allied command believed that by targeting German cities, they could disrupt civilian morale and industrial output, hastening the collapse of Nazi resistance. The German people, especially civilians, were seen as complicit in the war effort due to their support of Hitler's regime. But as the bombs fell, it became evident that civilians were bearing the brunt of this strategy. As the war entered its final stages, the Allies began to close in on the heart of Nazi Germany. The Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive, had failed, and the Allies were now poised to push into the very core of the Third Reich. The war in Europe was nearing its final months, and for the people of Germany, the hope of a quick end was beginning to feel as elusive as ever. Dresden, known for its beautiful Baroque architecture, its cultural landmarks, and its thriving arts scene, stood as a city untouched by the ravages of war until now. Its relative isolation from major military targets had spared it from the bombing campaigns that had shattered other cities. But that would soon change. On February 13, 1945, the city would be subjected to one of the most controversial bombing raids of the war. Over the course of 3 days, the British Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces would drop over 4,000 tons of bombs on Dresden. The objective was to create a firestorm that would decimate the city, killing tens of thousands and leaving the city in ruins. The bombs would fall not only on military sites but on civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. This bombing, while deemed necessary by military strategists, would leave an indelible mark on the German collective memory. It was in the wake of this destruction that American soldiers, now occupying the city, would take an unexpected step. Amid the smoldering ruins and the ghosts of a lost civilization, they began distributing candles to the survivors. By February 1945, Germany's cities had been plunged into darkness, not just by the nightly blackouts enforced to prevent aerial bombardment, but by the toll the war had taken on daily life. Power grids were either destroyed or inefficient. Fuel was scarce. The bombing campaigns had gutted critical infrastructure, including electrical plants and communication lines. In places like Dresden, where the cultural heartbeat of Germany once resonated, the hum of industry and the glow of streetlights had long since dimmed. Night after night, the civilians of Germany sat in their homes, eyes fixed on the blackness outside, waiting for the sirens that would signal another air raid. The blackouts had become a daily routine, one that instilled fear and a sense of helplessness. The Germans had learned to live with the terror of not knowing when the next attack would come, or if they would survive it. As much as the Nazi regime tried to maintain morale with propaganda, the reality was undeniable. German civilians were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. In this harsh new reality, candles had taken on an immense value, not just as a source of light, but as a reminder of survival. A single candle could light a room, bring warmth, and provide a moment of peace in the unrelenting darkness. But candles had become a precious commodity, rationed and guarded like any other wartime resource. Most Germans, after enduring years of shortages, could not afford to be wasteful with something so vital. Each candle burned had to be used sparingly, not just to light the way, but to maintain a sense of normalcy in a world that had all but forgotten what normality felt like. So, when American soldiers began arriving in the devastated city of Dresden, many Germans were still processing the shock of the bombing and the loss of their homes, their loved ones, and their way of life. The war was nearing its end, but the destruction had already scarred the land. The survivors of Dresden, emerging from their hiding places in the wreckage, would face a new chapter of their war-torn existence, the slow and painful rebuilding of their lives in the ashes of a city that had once been a beacon of German culture. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, many civilians wandered the streets, stunned by the magnitude of what had occurred. The firestorms had left them without shelter, without food, and often without family members. They had little to cling to, but one thing they could hold on to was the hope of rebuilding, of finding the strength to carry on. That's when American soldiers, who had seen their own share of destruction and loss on the battlefields of Europe, decided to offer something small yet meaningful to the stunned survivors. Candles. At first, this simple gesture confused the German civilians. The American soldiers had been their enemies, the very force responsible for the destruction of their beloved city. How could they, of all people, be offering kindness? But in that moment, the act was not just about the candle itself. It was about restoring a sense of humanity, a connection that transcended the battlefield. The candles they handed out were more than mere objects. They represented light in the most literal and symbolic sense. In a city consumed by darkness, these candles were a fleeting reminder that even amidst the most brutal of conflicts, moments of human decency and empathy could still exist. These small flames could not undo the destruction, but they offered the promise of hope in a world where hope had become increasingly rare. For the German civilians in Dresden, the sight of American soldiers distributing candles was nothing short of bewildering. It was a moment fraught with paradox. These soldiers were the ones responsible for the devastating air raids that had torn their city apart. These were the same enemy forces that had reduced their homes to rubble, leaving families homeless, cities decimated, and countless dead. How could they now extend a gesture of kindness? The people of Dresden, already reeling from the catastrophic destruction, were struggling to process the tragedy of what had happened. The blackened ruins of their homes were still smoldering, and the survivors, many of whom had lost everything, had yet to understand how to rebuild their shattered lives. The war had dragged on for nearly 6 years, and the relentless bombing raids had become a part of their nightly existence. The German population had grown used to the fear of the blackouts, the noise of distant bombers, and the destruction they brought. Yet, in the midst of this destruction, the simple act of receiving a candle felt like an alien gesture, one that, while deeply human, was entirely unexpected. Many of the civilians were initially suspicious. How could their enemies, soldiers who had been portrayed as the very embodiment of the invader, offer anything but destruction? It was a stark reminder of how the war had warped perceptions. The Germans had been taught to fear the Americans and to view them as the force that would bring about their downfall. Yet here they were, offering light, a small but significant gesture of peace. Over time, however, that suspicion gave way to gratitude. The candles offered something the civilians needed desperately: warmth, both physical and emotional. In the dark, cold nights that followed the bombing raids, the flame of a candle became a symbol of hope, a reminder that, even in the face of overwhelming destruction, some things, like kindness and humanity, still had the power to shine through. The strategic value of a candle might seem trivial in the grand context of war, but in the psychological theater of war, it was a potent tool. The bombings of German cities had been an essential part of the Allied strategy, but this act of kindness stood in stark contrast to the broader aims of the military campaign. In a world where enemies were often dehumanized, where cities were bombed without regard for civilian casualties, the American gesture was a calculated move to humanize their occupation. From a tactical standpoint, the distribution of candles was a psychological maneuver aimed at reshaping the narrative. The German civilians had, for years, been bombarded with propaganda portraying the Americans as ruthless invaders bent on the destruction of their homeland. The destruction of their cities, their infrastructure, and their way of life had been a bitter pill to swallow. But in that small, unexpected moment of humanity, the Americans introduced a new narrative, not of enemies, but of human beings who could, even in the worst of circumstances, extend compassion. This act of kindness wasn't just about winning over hearts and minds, it was about demonstrating moral superiority in a war defined by brutality. While the destruction of cities was viewed by the Allies as necessary to defeat Nazi Germany, it was also clear that the bombing campaigns had a devastating psychological impact on both the civilian population and the soldiers carrying out the raids. For the American soldiers, offering a candle was a way to reaffirm their own humanity in a war that often stripped away the very essence of it. For the civilians, the candle became a symbol of survival. In a city that had just been obliterated, receiving a small flame was an act of defiance against the darkness, both literal and metaphorical, that had consumed their lives. It was as if the American soldiers were saying, "We understand your suffering. We, too, are human." World War II was a war defined by technological marvels and the destructive power they unleashed. The conflict saw the development and deployment of advanced machinery and weapons, tanks, airplanes, rockets, and atomic bombs, each more powerful and devastating than the last. The technological arms race was central to the war, with both sides constantly striving to outdo each other in the quest for military supremacy. In such an environment, it might seem almost absurd to focus on something as simple and ancient as a candle, but the act of giving a candle in the ruins of Dresden serves as a stark reminder of the limitations of technology in the face of human suffering. The high-tech bombers that had rained destruction on the city were now contrasted by the low-tech simplicity of a candle. The light of a single candle could not undo the devastation caused by advanced weaponry, but it had a profound effect on the people who received it. In the context of a war dominated by technology, where the human toll was often reduced to a mere statistic, the candle was an unexpected symbol of human connection. It was the polar opposite of the weapons of war. It required no machine, no factory, no complex engineering. It was purely human, a small gesture that spoke volumes in its simplicity. The candle's humble flame was also symbolic of survival and resilience. After the firestorms that ravaged Dresden, reducing much of the city to ash, a single candle could light the way in the darkness and give survivors a sense of agency in a world where technology seemed to have stripped them of any control. In the shadow of high-tech warfare, the candle became a reminder that, no matter how advanced the weaponry, the human spirit could still find ways to endure and adapt. The decision for American soldiers to distribute candles in Dresden wasn't just a spontaneous act of goodwill. It was part of a broader strategy to foster goodwill and facilitate the post-war rebuilding of Europe. For the American leadership, the end of the war was not just about military victory. It was about securing a future of peace, rebuilding a war-torn continent, and preventing future conflicts. The idea was to demonstrate that, despite the brutal nature of war, the Allied forces could show compassion and leadership in their occupation of Germany. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, had always stressed the importance of treating the civilian populations of occupied countries with dignity. While the bombing campaigns were essential to weakening the Nazi war machine, the ultimate goal of the Allies was not only military victory, but also the restoration of peace and stability. Eisenhower's leadership style, emphasizing the importance of moral high ground, influenced the behavior of many American soldiers in the field. By distributing candles, American soldiers were not only showing empathy, but also reinforcing the broader American ethos of compassion. The gesture was not without its risks. It was a departure from the usual military protocol, which often emphasized the need to remain distant from the local population, particularly in enemy territory. But by offering something as simple as a candle, the soldiers humanized their presence. They were not just occupiers. They were people who recognized the shared human suffering brought on by war. In this sense, the act of giving a candle was also a demonstration of leadership. It showed that even in the most difficult of circumstances, a small act of kindness could have far-reaching effects. It could build bridges between warring nations, change perceptions, and set the stage for reconciliation after the devastation of conflict. It was an effort to move beyond the immediate violence of war and plant the seeds for a lasting peace in Europe. By the winter of 1945, the war was nearing its climax, and the Allies had begun to tighten their grip on Nazi Germany. The Western and Eastern fronts were slowly converging, and it was clear that the Third Reich was on the brink of collapse. However, for Germany's civilians, the worst was still to come. In early February, the Allied forces had made the decision to target Dresden, a city that had so far been spared from the worst of the aerial bombings. Dresden, located in the heart of Germany, had long been seen as a cultural and historical treasure. Known for its stunning architecture, classical music, and vibrant art scene, the city was also an important transportation hub, but its military significance had been somewhat overstated by the Allies. Nonetheless, the decision was made to conduct a massive bombing raid in an attempt to cripple Germany's ability to wage war, to demoralize the civilian population, and to force a quicker surrender. But Dresden's destruction would become one of the most controversial moments of the entire war. The raid began on the night of February 13, 1945, when over 1,300 British bombers, followed by more American bombers, dropped incendiary bombs on the city. The goal was to create a firestorm, a deadly and all-consuming blaze that would consume everything in its path. The results were catastrophic. As the bombs fell, the city was engulfed in flames. The heat was so intense that it ignited the roofs of buildings, caused large explosions in the munitions factories, and set the very air ablaze. Within hours, Dresden became a hellish inferno. People trapped in buildings were consumed by the flames. Civilians who had sought shelter in the city's underground bunkers found themselves suffocated by the intense heat and smoke. Thousands of men, women, and children were caught in the devastation. By the time the bombing had stopped, Dresden was reduced to a pile of rubble. The death toll was estimated at 25,000, though some estimates suggest it could have been much higher. The psychological and emotional toll on the civilians who survived was even greater. The city had been a symbol of German culture, but now it was a symbol of the cost of war. The residents of Dresden, already weary from years of conflict, were left to deal with the horrific aftermath of the raid. And yet, even as the last embers of the firestorm smoldered, something extraordinary began to take shape. In the ruins of Dresden, amid the broken buildings and the blackened streets, the first American soldiers arrived. They were not there to continue the destruction, but to oversee the occupation of the city in the final days of the war. The arrival of American soldiers in Dresden, in the wake of the horrific bombing raids, marked a critical turning point in the relationship between the occupying forces and the German civilians. It was an extraordinary moment, one in which an act of kindness defied the brutality of war. The soldiers, many of whom had grown up in small American towns, were accustomed to a sense of community and shared responsibility. They had witnessed the horrors of war and understood that, even though they were soldiers, they were still human beings who had the power to act with empathy. For the civilians of Dresden, this was an unexpected turn of events. In a city that had just experienced such unimaginable destruction, the arrival of the enemy forces might have been anticipated with fear and hatred. The American soldiers, however, began distributing something profoundly simple: candles. It was an act that seemed almost absurd in the face of such devastation. How could a small candle possibly make a difference in the smoldering ruins of Dresden? But the candle symbolized something far more powerful than just a practical item. In the aftermath of the bombing, the survivors of Dresden were living in a world of total darkness. Their homes had been destroyed, their families torn apart, and the night sky had become an ever-present reminder of the bombers who had descended from above. In this dark world, the flame of a single candle represented more than just light. It represented a flicker of hope, a spark of humanity, in a time when all seemed lost. The soldiers did not simply offer the candles as material gifts. They were giving something deeper. They were offering empathy, acknowledging the shared suffering of the German people. For those who had survived the bombing, the act of receiving a candle was both humbling and overwhelming. It was a gesture that seemed to erase the lines of the battlefield, if only for a moment. The soldiers, who had once been their enemies, were now offering something as simple as light, showing that, despite everything, humanity could still prevail over the cruelty of war. For the German civilians, who had spent years under the harsh rule of the Nazi regime, this gesture was equally powerful. It was as though the American soldiers were reaching out across the divide, extending a hand to those who had been taught to see them as the enemy. It was a moment of recognition that the war had not just affected soldiers, it had affected families, communities, and individuals on both sides. The gesture of a candle was a small but profound acknowledgement of shared suffering. This act was not without its complexities. There were some Germans who could not fathom the kindness of their occupiers. How could they, after the destruction they had suffered, accept something so simple from those who had been responsible for much of it? But for many others, the act was a turning point. It was a recognition that in the midst of war's brutality, there could still be moments of compassion, and that peace was not just the absence of war, it was the restoration of human dignity. In the days following the destruction of Dresden, the city lay in ruins. The once beautiful streets, lined with historic buildings and cultural landmarks, were now a haunting expanse of twisted metal, collapsed brick, and scorched earth. The vast majority of Dresden's infrastructure was destroyed, including its historic center, which had been home to countless monuments of German heritage. Entire districts had been wiped out, and much of the population was either dead or missing. The survivors, those fortunate enough to emerge from the wreckage, were left to navigate a world of utter devastation. The death toll from the bombings was staggering, with estimates ranging from 25,000 to as many as 100,000 civilians. In a city with a pre-war population of around 600,000, the scale of destruction was incomprehensible. Families were torn apart, homes were lost, and the emotional scars left behind would haunt the city for generations. For those who had survived the bombs, the task of survival was far from over. The German civilians had already endured years of war and its horrors, but the bombing of Dresden marked the ultimate test of their resilience. While the Allied forces had justified the raids as a necessary military strategy to break the will of the German people and disrupt Nazi operations, the scale of the carnage raised questions about the morality of targeting civilian populations. The destruction of Dresden, often seen as an unnecessary excess, would become a symbol of the brutal cost of war. For the German people, particularly in Dresden, the bombings represented the very real face of Allied wartime policy, and the aftermath would fuel resentment and confusion. But amidst the devastation, the distribution of candles by American soldiers marked a small but significant turning point. It was a gesture that stood in stark contrast to the relentless destruction that had come before. The soldiers' actions were not without their own emotional weight. Many had seen the toll war had taken on both sides. For them, the act of offering a candle was a way of expressing empathy, of showing that even in the darkest moments, there could still be light. While the immediate focus was on rebuilding the city and caring for the survivors, the gesture would not be easily forgotten. It was not just the physical act of receiving a candle that mattered, but the message it conveyed, that even in the depths of war, the capacity for kindness and understanding could still shine through. In the broader context of the war, the destruction of Dresden and the subsequent acts of kindness by American soldiers reflected a deeper tension between the brutality of war and the moral considerations of the people involved. The bombing raids on German cities had been a key element of Allied strategy, aimed at weakening Germany's military capacity and undermining the Nazi regime's control over its population. Yet, as the war drew to a close, questions arose about the ethics of such tactics. The bombing of Dresden, in particular, remained a point of contention, with many questioning whether it had been a disproportionate response, especially considering the city's limited military significance. For the survivors in Dresden, the act of receiving a candle was not just a moment of compassion, it was an opening for reflection. The civilians had been living in a world where the distinction between combatants and non-combatants had become increasingly blurred. The Allies had seen the German civilian population as complicit in the Nazi regime's actions, but the survivors of Dresden were far from being willing participants in the war. For them, the American soldiers' actions represented a reminder that despite the horrors they had experienced, they were still worthy of compassion and dignity. In the years following the war, as Europe slowly began to rebuild, the story of the candles became a symbol of the potential for reconciliation. It was not just about physical rebuilding, but about healing the psychological wounds that had been inflicted by years of brutal conflict. The American soldiers who had participated in this act of kindness, though part of a military force responsible for the destruction, were now seen in a more nuanced light by some of the German survivors. They were no longer just the enemy. They were human beings who understood the value of empathy and kindness even in the most unimaginable of circumstances. The candles handed out in the wake of the bombing of Dresden would become a lasting symbol of the complexities of war. They represented not just the division between warring nations, but the shared humanity that transcended national borders. In a war that had taken so much, the simple act of offering a candle became a powerful reminder that there was more to humanity than destruction. It was a symbol of the possibility for light, for peace, even in the darkest of times. This moment would not erase the devastation, nor could it undo the deaths and suffering caused by the war. But it was an act that transcended the immediate cruelty of battle and, for many, became a small beacon of hope in a world that had been torn apart. It would remind both the German civilians and the American soldiers that even in the darkest hours, human decency could still triumph. In the aftermath of war, as the dust settled and Europe began to rebuild, the act of giving candles in Dresden became a symbol far beyond its immediate context. It wasn't just a simple gesture. It was a profound moment of humanity in a time when the world had been consumed by violence, hatred, and suffering. The civilians of Dresden, who had experienced the worst of human cruelty, were presented with a moment of compassion that transcended the boundaries of conflict. This small act of kindness, an offering of light amidst overwhelming darkness, became a testament to the possibility of reconciliation after the horrors of war. The destruction of Dresden itself remains a contentious topic, a subject of debate that raises questions about the morality of targeting civilian populations in wartime. The death toll was staggering, and the psychological scars left on the survivors were deep. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, the candles were more than just a practical tool. They symbolized something far greater: the possibility of healing, of moving beyond the brutality of war, and of finding common ground even after the deepest divisions. For the American soldiers, who had participated in an unforgiving and often brutal campaign, the act of giving a candle was a personal acknowledgement of the human cost of the war. Many of these soldiers had seen the destruction of cities, the devastation of families, and the unimaginable loss of life. They were not immune to the trauma of war themselves, but in that moment, they understood that what they were giving wasn't just light. It was a recognition of shared suffering. It was an offering that said, "We understand. We, too, have endured." The candles, though small in their physical presence, had a lasting emotional impact. They became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the most challenging of times, small acts of decency could make a world of difference. The war had created an immense divide between the German and Allied populations, but those candles, glowing softly in the dark, represented a flicker of understanding that transcended the enmity between them. In the broader scope of history, the story of Dresden's devastation and the kindness shown by American soldiers serves as a reflection of the complexities of war itself. War is not just a clash of armies and technologies, it is a clash of humanity, and it leaves behind not just the physical scars of destruction, but the psychological scars of those who survive it. The decision to drop those bombs on Dresden, the immense loss of life that followed, and the moral questions that still linger, all point to the heavy cost of conflict. But the candle represents something different. It represents the enduring possibility of compassion in a world that often seems devoid of it. In the face of overwhelming destruction, the smallest flicker of light can remind us of our shared humanity. It's a reminder that, no matter how deep the wounds of war may be, the human spirit has the capacity to heal, to rebuild, and to find light in the darkest of times. The story of the candles in Dresden is not just about the war, but about the people caught in its wake. The survivors, the soldiers, the civilians who were forced to rebuild their lives in a shattered world. It's a story of resilience, of enduring hope, and of the possibility that, even in the bleakest moments, there can be kindness. As history marches on, it is moments like these that we must hold on to, for they remind us of the potential for humanity to rise above even the most horrific chapters of our shared past. In the end, it is the light of those small, flickering candles that continues to shine, symbolizing the strength of the human spirit in the face of war's darkest hours.